In December of 1755, Williamson and his 100 trainees marched west to one of several places in the Pennsylvania frontier that badly needed defense. On the 26th of December, they arrived in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, the locals of which asked them if they could scout and investigate an abandoned town just to the west, which had been deserted due to Indian attacks. After dark, Peter took 50 troops to go and look at things. They were almost there. The town was in sight, just across the river, when, like ghosts, a group of Indians started shooting at them from behind. A couple people fell. Peter made the split-second decision to order a running fire across the river towards the church building in the town. They would run and shoot at the same time. It worked well until they hit the water. It was cold. Freezing cold. Finally, they got across and got inside. More than 30 people made it to the church. They started shooting from the windows, keeping the Indians from getting close enough to light the building on fire and burn them all. Some people started lighting the pews on fire for warmth. They really needed it because they were still wet from the river, and the December weather was not generous. For an impressive 6 hours, they were able to hold like that. But when they started to get low on ammo and powder, they knew they had to do something. Peter, being the commanding officer, it was his job to make a decision. He thought about it and saw that there was only one way out of this. They would have to run for it, all at once. A lot of them would die, but if they made it to the wood line, they might be able to make it back to Bethlehem. They started preparing, and they went for it. Out of over 30 people, 5 of them made it out of the town. 2 of them froze to death before dawn. Peter and 2 others were lucky enough to make it back to Bethlehem and tell everyone what happened. Peter's commanding officer, when he heard about the situation, decided to send 1,600 troops to help them out. In the meantime, Peter and his remaining men were to start building defenses. On January 6th, the 1,600 arrived. They moved into the abandoned town, ready to bury the dead men that went with Peter the previous week. And they found bones. No meat, just bones. And the church where they made their stand was burned to the ground. The dead men appeared to have been cannibalized. They buried what they could and started building a fort on the site where the church once stood. They called it Fort Allen. I wonder what happened to this place called Fort Allen, just to the west of Bethlehem. Probably nothing important. After the fort was complete, 1,400 troops, including Peter, went even further west. What they saw gave them an eerie feeling. Places that had been occupied 2 years ago were now in the early stages of being reclaimed by nature. The past century of building had been undone just that fast. This would be the closest that Native Americans would ever come to being really free of European colonization. The troops began making contact with the places and people who managed to keep their land safe. Then they started setting up defenses. They set up a whole network in the local area where they would regularly patrol, and they would skirmish with Indians wherever they saw them. They scavenged for food, and tried to curb the high rate of scalpings on the frontier. In January, though, Peter knew that his 3-month break from the British Army would be over, and he would have to leave the Pennsylvania militia. He would cease being a minor officer on the frontier and return to being a foot soldier in a fort along the Great Lakes. He reports to Major Kinnair back in New York. He and a group of soldiers are ordered to destroy an Indian town located to the north of Fort Duquesne. They do so orderly and efficiently. And then they march back up to Oswego. On his way, he gets into another skirmish and gets shot in the hand, losing the ability to move 2 of his fingers. He arrives at the fort in July of 1756 to find a French attack more imminent than when he left. 2 days after his return to the fort, scouts report that the French are transporting equipment overland nearby. 500 men, including Peter, are sent to attack them. They start hunting down the French, and themselves get hunted down by a group of Indians. There's a brief skirmish in the woods, and the Indians are driven off. Not many casualties on either side because everyone had trees to hide behind. The group keeps moving. Peter tells a story about an Irishman who was put on guard duty one night. He found a barrel of rum that was unattended and helped himself. Not looking good for those stereotypes. Anyway, after he passed out, they found his body in the morning, scalpless. The commanding officer examined him and was about to order his burial when, to everyone's surprise, he woke up. He didn't even realize he was scalpless until someone told him, and he felt his own head. Nobody thought he would live. They got him to a surgeon and bandaged up his head, and waited. He didn't die the first day, or the second, or the third. His head started to heal up. Peter tells us that just before they parted ways, months after the incident, the man was actually alive and well. They kept traveling and were eventually attacked by a group of 500 French and Indians. They were able to hold a defensive position and fight them off, killing 130 of the enemy and only losing 74 themselves. They took some prisoners and were informed by them that the French army had very low morale and was very badly supplied. It might have been a hopeful sign. The expedition returns to the fort. Within a few weeks, the siege of Oswego would begin. It was the 2nd week in August. The estimates give the French about 5,000 soldiers ready to attack. They have boats on the water, and they're moving their cannons closer to the fort. On the morning of the 10th, some British ships attack the French Navy, but the French cannons overpower them. By the afternoon, they had infantry on the shore, and later that night they would be ready to start digging trenches, so they could work their way closer to the fort's walls. Throughout the 11th, musket fire and cannonballs were traded between the two sides all day. The 12th wouldn't be much different. On the night of the 13th, the 370 men inside Fort Ontario, one of the 3 British forts all next to each other, began to pack up or destroy anything that might be useful to the French, as they planned to abandon it. Under cover of darkness, they rush across the river to one of the other forts, without injury. The nights of the 12th and the 13th, French militia are harassing the west side of the river. They try to prepare artillery, but those in the old fort, the second of the 3 forts, our friend Peter being among them, kept cannons aimed and firing at them. On the morning of the 14th, things get rowdy. 2,500 Canadian militia and Indians cross the river towards the old fort, which is defended by only 500 British regulars. The commander of the old fort, seeing this, asks the opposing commander for terms of surrender. He is to surrender all British soldiers to be prisoners of war, and they will be treated well. The deal is accepted. The healthy, able-bodied defenders are escorted out, while the Indians storm the fort and brutally scalp all the sick and wounded as they scream and beg for mercy. From all 3 forts combined, the French gained massive amounts of cannons, guns, and ammunition, as well as over 1,700 prisoners of war. In addition, with the lower shore of the Great Lake under French control, the land to the south of it, large sections of upstate New York between Pennsylvania, Erie, and Albany, were now open to French attack. This was a sizable victory for the French in the North American theater. On the 16th, they started transporting the prisoners. The destination is Quebec by way of Montreal. They arrive in Montreal on the 18th, and while there, the French try to convince the prisoners to join the French army, or at the very least help them out by doing busy work on the battlefield. The vast majority, including Peter, refuse. Those that refused to help the French military were further moved to a place in Quebec, arriving there on September 5th, the beginning of autumn. The countryside in Quebec had been drained of able-bodied workers. As such, while there was a lot of corn and other crops ready for harvest, there was a shortage of people to harvest it. Many of the prisoners volunteered for that work rather than sit in a cell all day, but the turnover rate for this job was high because the prisoners in the cells were actually given more food than the farm laborers. It wasn't long before the French began to worry. Not about food, well, partially about food, but mostly about the fact that there were hundreds of British prisoners in Quebec being guarded by only 18 French soldiers. 18. Needless to say, I wouldn't want to be one of those 18 French soldiers. It made for a nervous situation. Because of this, a prisoner exchange deal was quickly made with England in October, and over 500 prisoners, including Peter, were set free as part of the deal. They would be given transportation to England. After a 6-week journey by boat, Peter arrived in Plymouth, England, and was given a grand total of 6 shillings as payment for his military service. For the 3rd time in his life, his entire life was reset, and he was made to start all over again.
Creek, nimm mich heim. Bin ich naus früh am Tag, war der Piwi schon da.